says we're streaming live on Facebook, so I believe it. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Sefaria's Siyum on Masechet Shekalim, the strangest of all the Daf Yomi Siyumim. I know my guest for today will agree with that, but I'm really excited, and Mazal Tov to those who are finishing. If you've joined us for any of these before, then you know that a Siyum is like a Talmud party. A Siyum is a party that we have a celebration of finishing a significant amount of material. Think again, this Masechet especially, this tractate, even though it was short, was heavy, was a lot, and those of us who are finishing are really celebrating. And if you didn't finish and you just dipped in a little bit, you should still feel happy and excited to be going on to the next tractate, which I think will feel easy by comparison. Or maybe you loved Shekalim, and if so, you should definitely tell us about that in the chat. We'd love to hear everybody's reactions to this tractate. I'm Sara Wolkenfeld. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at Sefaria, and I'm really honored to be here today with Avigayil Halpern, who is an amazing student of Talmud, teacher of Talmud. And Abigail, I will let you introduce yourself.
Great. Hi, I'm Abigail. I'm in my second year studying for rabbinic ordination at the Hadar Institute. I'm coming to you from Washington Heights, New York. A project I'm really excited about that I'm working on right now is I write a weekly feminist Parsha newsletter called Approaching. And Lizzie's going to put the link to that in the chat. And that's been an exciting Torah project I'm working on right now alongside Daf Yomi, which is also a really exciting Torah project. And I'm excited to dive into some of the fun parts of Shekalim.
Always an exciting Torah project. I will share my screen, and my amazing colleague, Lizzie Frankel, will be sharing links in the chat so that you can keep up with where we are. And you're also welcome to put your questions throughout in the chat. Questions, comments, keep them coming, and we will check in with those from time to time. I just want to note before we jump into those pieces, hopefully you know by now that Sefaria is a great place to learn Daf Yomi. We make the Daf accessible in a number of different ways, even with Shekalim, which was, again, part of the Yerushalmi, and there's a really interesting history as to how this got included in the Daf Yomi cycle. But here we all are, and we did our best at Sefaria to make sure that you could access both the Hebrew Aramaic as well as the English, divided both according to the traditional division of the Yerushalmi and with the Daf Yomi division. So the Talmud is in our library. We add it regularly. It has English as well as vocalization. You can get it actually with or without vocalization. And the next Masechet in the Daf Yomi cycle, Yoma, is up and ready to go. So if you're getting a head start, you can check that out now. And you can always find the day's Daf as well as other learning schedules on Sefaria's calendar, which is on our library page. So this image just shows you where to find it, Daf Yomi in the calendar page. This is not what it looks like today, because it's not Erevin, but you could find it there, as well as other calendar pieces. And we hope you'll join us for the coming Masechet as well. And now, Abigail, we can jump into some of our favorite pieces of Masechet Shekalim. When we were talking about this tractate as a whole, we realized that, I think unlike sometimes other tractates, which maybe overpromise in their titles, you could have a tractate that has a name, and you realize the tractate isn't really necessarily about that. Like Psachim was about the Passover sacrifice, but not as much about the holiday of Passover as we experience it. It was a little more digging. Shekalim really is about Shekalim. It's about the money that was donated to the temple on a regular basis. And this theme of fiduciary responsibility and leadership comes up throughout. I know that you and I both had our struggles with this tractate, but I think for me, it was really fascinating. At the end of the day, I have to admit, it was fascinating to see the functioning of the temple in this kind of nitty-gritty way, and kind of almost getting an insight into like the temple boardroom and how they balance their budgets. So that was really interesting. Do you want to tell us about the first text that we selected?
Happily. So this was one of the pieces that really stood out to me as I was going through the Masechet, which is this piece basically talks about Shekalim as atonement either for the golden calf or for the sin of Joseph being sold by his brothers in Genesis. And so, right, either Joseph was sold, according to this piece, because they transgressed the 10 Commandments. The Jewish people transgressed the 10 Commandments by building the golden calf. Or or because they sold the firstborn of Rachel, i.e. Joseph, for 20 pieces of silver. And so there are these two reasons for why, for essentially, if we assume that bringing the shekel, the half shekel, is a form of atonement for some sin, this little sugya here, this little piece, is giving us two possible reasons. And I think these are very different reasons in an important way, which is the golden calf. We have the axis of communal versus individual or personal, which is the golden calf is a communal sin. And the sale of Joseph is really this interpersonal problem between himself and his brothers. And we also have this axis of where is God in the picture. And the golden calf is really, we think of it as a direct sin between the Jewish people together sinned against God. And the sale of Joseph is really Joseph's brothers sinned against him. And I think these two axes really capture two different things about bringing the Machatzit HaShekel as comes up in this Masechet, which is that this communal versus individual axis captures that on one hand, you want every person bringing the shekel. This is really, right, like every person has to give it. That's what characterizes it, or at least every adult male citizen. Bracketing that for now.
Bracket that for your feminist commentary.
Yeah, exactly. Putting that aside. But it's also a communal sacrifice that really fuels this whole community and communal worship through the Beit HaMikdash. And then the second axis, I think, of interpersonal relationships versus human-divine relationships comes up throughout, I think, all the sources we're going to talk about, where on one hand, we think of the Beit HaMikdash as this site of sanctity. It's totally transcendent. It's where we worship God in a way that's ideally maybe unfettered from the tensions of human life. And on the other hand, the entire Masechet is about navigating the interpersonal, complicated human relationships that go into sustaining the space.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting, both of those pieces. I also just wonder, big picture, what it even means to say that we give this money, that the whole institution of giving this money, which is how the tractate opens, right? That you have to announce about the giving of the money and everybody has to give the money. Like you said, every adult male gives this money. And like what it means to even frame all of that in terms of a kapara, that we're atoning for something that happens in our past. Like I was thinking about this as I was cramming the rest of the Masechet last night. Like, do you think that's just like a manifestation of Jewish guilt? That like we kind of, we associate like everything is about something that we did wrong in the past. I'm not sure. I think it's a really interesting choice.
That's a really interesting point. I hadn't thought about it like that. Yeah, I think it's particularly interesting because and I think the last few prakim also saw a lot about different kinds of korbanot, mincha and olah, and right. And so to assume that this is a kapara and is in that genre of sacrifices, right? Why not say that this is some sort of olat nedava, like people are just bringing it out of generosity? I wonder. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I wonder if there's something to it being mandatory that leads Chazal to read it this way. That what are the sacrifices that people really have to bring are much more in the genre of a chatat.
Yeah.
The other kinds of korbanot, of sacrifices, are more voluntary.
Yeah, I think that could definitely be part of it. And also I think that there is something, this doesn't necessarily speak to my question specifically about the kapara, but I do think there's something about tying it back to these, maybe you could call them inflection points in Jewish history. And, on the one hand, these are places where, let's say it's like Jewish history gone wrong. These were bad things that happened. That's how we think about them. On the other hand, they're so definitional to the way that things worked out that it's almost a little hard to think about them that way or to really feel so terrible about them. They kind of shape just the way everything happens. I mean, especially I think with the sale of Joseph, like, okay, we wound up in Egypt, but we were always supposed to wind up in Egypt. This was all supposed to happen. It was foretold to Abraham. So like, how bad was it really, except as you said, on the interpersonal level. So I do think that that's really interesting, and that maybe, as you said, as we read all of the tractate through the lens of those two axes that you identified, we're also supposed to keep identifying it back to the rest of Jewish history, the familiar parts of Jewish history. How did we get here from there? So I do think that that's really interesting. And I think that the piece that you introduced about the sort of communal responsibility, I think that comes up really in the next piece that we picked here.
Yeah. Okay. So the next two pieces really are about this question of, one of the topics that comes up in this Masechet is the Trimat Mahalishka, where an assigned person goes into the room that's essentially full of the collected shekels and takes them out at specific intervals through the year to be used for the needs of the Beit HaMikdash, like daily sacrifices, etc. And the Sugya talks at length about how all of the precautions that were taken so it wouldn't appear that this agent who went in to take out this money is stealing any of it. And one of the really striking images here is the one who's curly-haired. Someone who has curly hair can't go in to take out this money because of suspicion, i.e. suspicion that this person will hide the coins in their curly hair. And the Sugya resolves this by saying, no, they would just comb his hair afterwards to make sure there were no, sneaky shekels in there. And then the following source suggests we're still really concerned about theft in this situation, especially theft from the Beit HaMikdash is extremely serious business. And here it's also theft really from the donations of the community, which I think amplifies how concerned we would want to be about it. And it says, Medabrin hayu imo mish'ashu nichnas ad sha'ashu yotze. So the person who goes in, the people outside the chamber would talk to him the entire time he was in there. They would hold up a conversation, because if he was talking, he couldn't hide coins in his mouth. And the Gemara, in good Gemara fashion, says, isn't there an easier way to do this? He should just take a drink of water and hold it in his mouth, and then we know that he can't put coins in his mouth because there's water in his mouth. But that doesn't work, because mipnei habracha. No, there's a blessing he has to make when he goes into the chamber as part of this process. And if his mouth is full of water, he can't make the blessing. So that wouldn't work. And so instead we have this conversation. And I think that this mipnei habracha is really striking in particular because it highlights we want to be really careful. We want to take every precaution. We're going to comb this person's hair out. We're going to talk to him the whole time. But if we become so cautious, there's a point at which we can't do what you're supposed to be doing anymore. And I think the dynamics of where is this mistrust coming from comes up a lot. Do we just want to be really careful for the sake of appearances, or is there some sort of real fear? Like, how much is this about we just want the absolute appearance of this is a completely above the board, unimpeachably ethical process? And how much is it that these were regulations developed because people kept putting coins in their hair? And I think that the former sounds more plausible to me, but I'm wondering what you think of that.
Yeah, I agree. I really don't. I mean, it's hard to imagine the like coins in their hair, coins in their mouth. That's like a little bit hard for me to wrap my mind around that people were really doing that so much. So I think I do, my inclination, and would be happy to have anyone else weigh in, but my inclination is to say not that there was a culture of stealing, but that rather they were trying to do everything in like the most above board way possible, which, did we put it on this sheet? I can't remember. It does come up. No, I guess we didn't put that part on. But it comes up, I think, in this section in a few places. They bring in this pasuk of Beinei Elokim va'adam, that you want it to look right in the eyes of God and the people, right? Everyone should, like you said, it should be done in a way that's like super above board and seems really, really kosher. And that feels easier for me to kind of imagine, because otherwise it is just kind of comical. Like, where else could people, and why are we like, discriminating against curly-haired people? Like, it seems pretty intense. But it is a really interesting thing, and I think it gets into this theme again of the fiduciary responsibility piece that, and that was another big thing for me in this tractate also, that even though I think I maybe should have known because I've read stuff about it before, like having read through like the book of Leviticus, you get a sense of temple practice a little bit, but just the huge quantity of money that was flowing through this system, I don't think I ever really had a handle on that until now. It was just so much money all the time. And so I feel like the message of the parts that you just read is like, yeah, probably people aren't going to stick coins in their hair. Probably people aren't going to stick coins in their mouth, but with so much money just everywhere. And, that comes up like later in the tractate also, right? When you have like, you find money on the street, you find an animal on the street, there's just like stuff everywhere because there's so much stuff associated with the temple. And this idea that you have to be so super careful about it. And I think that plays into this source about Moshe also, this idea of responsibility in leadership. This was my personal favorite, my don't miss of the tractate. I think just because it's so different. I don't know, right? Some parts of the Yerushalmi felt like, oh yeah, you kind of see where that comes from. You have a very similar idea in the Babylonian Talmud somewhere. This was not so familiar to me. The idea that Moses was wealthy and there were questions about where Moses's wealth came from, not actual questions, right? Getting back to your point. Moshe made all his money totally above board. God helped him, whatever, but there was this question about suspicion. And so this verse in Exodus, V'hibitu achrei Moshe ad bo'o ha'ohela, that they watched Moshe until he got into the tent, that the people were watching Moshe. So you can see the verse, maybe if it loads. And right, whenever Moses went out to the tent, all the people would rise and stand, each at the entrance of his tent, and gaze after Moses until he'd entered the tent. Seems pretty innocent, but there are two different interpretations, one positive, one negative. And the negative one was that they would say, look at his legs, look at his feet, look at his flesh, see how healthy he is. Everything he eats comes from us. Everything he drinks comes from us. All of his assets are taken from us. Like, they were suspicious of him as a leader. They accused him of corruption, basically, and taking money. And that's like I think projecting this onto Moshe, that's like the thing that you don't want to have happen with the temple, right? That's like the fear, is that anyone who comes in contact is going to be suspect because there's so much wealth there. And I don't know, I'm just so struck by this image of like the people watching Moshe and thinking these dark thoughts. Again, the one hand, it kind of goes with so many stories in the Torah, but it's still really sad for me. And then the favorable one is that they watched him and they said, we desire to view the righteous, and one who merits to view Moshe earns great rewards. Right, that like there's a special schut, there's a special benefit that comes from watching someone as great as Moshe. But I think to be that kind of leader, really, who merits that view from the people, you have to really be combing out your curly hair, and you have to be like spitting out the water and stuff, because otherwise people are going to suspect you. So I don't know. That's my take on this Moshe piece. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add there, but I was so struck by this.
Something that I'm noticing this time that I hadn't noticed even certainly the first time I learned it, and even in our prep, is that I had, I think, misremembered this as people were looking at his wealth favorably or looking at his wealth unfavorably, and that's actually not what it is, right? That it's actually either they were upset because they were saying, look how healthy he is, all of this food he's eating is coming from us, and he's sort of exploiting us or using our money. And then the second one is just, no, we want to see him.
Right.
Not as a positive view of money. And I think there's some parallel universe version of this text that gets into a prosperity gospel. Oh, Moshe had a lot of money because that's good and that's a symbol of leadership and there's a deservingness. And I think it's really interesting that that's not in this text. That there's suspicion, and then there's admiring Moshe because he's a tzaddik, because he's righteous, but there's not this sense of the wealth as itself representing that righteousness.
That is really interesting. Also that it's so embodied, like that's what your comment made me think of also, that it's like looking at like him physically, which like, I don't know, I kind of think that people must have seen him, right? Like he, kind of all the time, like, oh, he's just Moshe. But there is something about his physical presence that's very effective here, and maybe also goes along with the rest of this tractate. Like again, the hair, the mouth, right? It's all about your body and how your body kind of like interacts with the wealth and with the money around you. So there's that aspect also. It's just really interesting. And again, I don't know, again, please guys, feel free to comment. But I can't think of a great, there are a lot of sources about Moses in the Bavli, in the Babylonian Talmud, not thinking of a strong parallel to this conversation. So if you have that parallel, please go ahead and drop it in the comments. All yours, Abigail, for the secret
Great.
chamber.
Yes. So this was one of my personal favorite Mishnayot. What stood out to me about it from all of Shekalim is that, like we've been discussing, there is so much caution around money, and so much we don't want any single coin getting misplaced. They are all sacred, and both we have the sanctity of the coins and we have this caution of seeming ethically scrupulous and avoiding theft. And this is a totally different picture of what happens with money, which is there's this Lishkat Chashaim, literally a chamber of secrets, but it does not have a bad snake in it. Instead, it's full of these secret donations of money. And righteous people put money into this chamber, and poor people, anim b'nei tovim, so poor people of noble descent, secretly come and take the money. And this is, I think, just really interesting in that it's basically this opposite version of what happens with the Trumat Mahalishka, where they go and they take the money out of the store of Shekalim, where it's very, very regulated and supervised. And here, the ideal vision is for people to give secretly and take secretly, and have this, I think, when the Talmud talks about anim b'nei tovim, poor people of noble descent, what it's highlighting is what is the most dignified way to give someone what they need, and how can we make it as minimally embarrassing as possible to help someone sustain themselves. And I think this is really striking as almost a pushback to some of the rest of the Masechet. No, you just go and you take what you need. And we're not going to supervise, and we're not going to regulate, and we're just going to trust people who work it out on their own.
Yeah, this really reminded me actually of, we don't have one here locally, but I don't know what it's called, but like the refrigerators that people have been putting up during the pandemic. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, the community fridges.
Community fridges, right? Where like people just fill them all the time and people can go and take. That's what I thought of when I got to this Mishnah, is just this space where anyone can come and take. And like you said, they're people of nobility, but I think the nobility here, to me, the like implication of that is like they're going to take what they need. Right? So like you said, there's a really high level of trust here, trust that people will put it in, trust that people will take what they need, and a really dignified way of supporting themselves. I agree. This is the beautiful part of the temple. No dead animals and no suspicion of money laundering or anything like that. Yeah, I agree. And then the last verse we chose is back to the suspicious part. I don't know how you kind of square it with that. But I did love this image also.
Yeah, we have these horns, these shofarot, which is a familiar word from Rosh Hashanah, right? These horns that they would collect all of the shkalim in and other kinds of donations. And they were narrow at the top and wide at the bottom, so you couldn't put your hand in when you were putting the shekel in and take it out with other shkalim. And yeah, something we talked about that has come up a little bit already is just, what is the cultural impact of this? I feel very on the fence of, on one hand, this is a vision of the functioning of the Beit HaMikdash, of the temple, as really, really so careful about money. You know it's going to be absolutely trusted, which I wonder historically what it might be reacting to. But right, is this promoting, at least in the rabbinic imagination, if not in reality, which I'm not going to take a position on, this idealized version of the temple where really the functioning is so careful, and really it wants to be a site where nothing bad can happen, and even the structures are set up to discourage temptation and sin? Or, on the other hand, is this a vision of the Beit HaMikdash where the Beit HaMikdash is this sort of institution that is suspicious of everybody else who comes to the Beit HaMikdash, and we don't trust even the people who seem to be bringing donations, maybe they're faking you out, to actually take some of the shkalim back? And I feel very torn about which it is. I feel like it's ambiguous even from all of shkalim, if I like this attitude or if I don't, or what the attitude even is.
Yeah, I feel more drawn towards, the more generous reading, that they're just being really on the up and up. But I hear it, and it reminds me, I can't remember which parak it was in, but there's the part that lists all the people the person who was in charge of this and the person who was in charge of that, and my personal favorite, the guy in charge of stomach aches. And then at some point in the Gemara discussing it, it says, wait, are we naming all these people because they were the best possible example of that position? Or maybe they were the worst possible example of the people who held that position. And so I think what I'm saying is that I wonder if the tractate itself holds that tension and holds that ambiguity. And that's why you're really feeling that. Like, I wonder if they're not really entirely sure themselves. I'm also not going to take a stab at the historical reality, but I do have the sense that there's an ambiguity and a real, and just that throughout traditional Jewish sources, there's always a fear of having a lot of money concentrated in one place. And some of the rules that get mentioned here have echoes in other sources. Like, you should always have multiple people counting the money. You should always have multiple people allocating the money. Like, those are reflected in other sources and also just, I think, make sense. So I do feel like it's kind of okay to hold on to both of those pieces, but it's complicated. We were talking before this started about how most, maybe all, you'll tell me, Abigail, but I think, all the Masechtot that I've learned and finished in the Babylonian Talmud, all the tractates ends on kind of an up note. They tend to be very well edited at the end. And so ideally what I'd like to see now is like the resolution of that tension that you mentioned. Really like, I'd like to know for sure that they were just running things on the up and up. And that was the emphasis. That's not exactly where the tractate ends, although it's like a little bit of an up note, but you have to wait for it. You have to work on it. So I'm going to read the end of the Masechet. I'm starting from, if you're following along at home and you're not using the sheet that we have in front of us right now, it's the very end of 22a as it's divided by dapim. And I'm gonna skim a little bit through the first part because I don't want to get too bogged down in the machloket that's represented here. Noting that that's hard to do in the Yerushalmi, it's hard to do in the Jerusalem Talmud, where every word contains so much meaning. Essentially, what's being referenced here is a previous disagreement. Actually, really interesting to think of in terms of like, what if, Abigail, all of the hypothetical questions you raised came crashing down on us into reality? It's about what would happen or what will happen when the temple is rebuilt. And can we consecrate money now? Can we create hekdash? Can we sanctify money for the temple now when there is no temple? Like, what would happen if I pulled out my half shekel and I tried to reconstruct the shofarot system in my living room? Does that money acquire sanctity or not? So that's the basic outline of the machloket, of the disagreement that's being referenced now. Rabbi Yudan Antudraya Ba'akume Rabbi Yosei, Haka Atamar Kachu, Vahaka Atamar Lo Kachu. So Rabbi Yoda Antudraya is asking Rabbi Yosei, how come there's a contradiction? There's a seeming contradiction in two of your opinions. In one place, you seem to imply that money would be consecrated. In another place, you seem to imply it would not be consecrated. Again, if you're consecrating shekels in the present day, and this was quoting Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda in the name of Rabbi Shimon. So referencing a different position, but again, that machloket is does the money become hekdesh or does it not? So Amarle, he says back to him, Taman lachen in makdushin lachachila, l'fisha mitzvah lahakriv mitruma chadasha. So there, when it comes to just, again, putting aside shekel, you shouldn't do that lechatchila nowadays. You shouldn't ideally, initially, ab initio, do that nowadays, because the mitzvah is to bring the money from the communal, is to take money from the collection of shekels for the communal offerings each year from the new collection of half shekels, right? It has to be the up-to-date collection, as though the shekels make a difference, but it has to be up to date. Right? In this case, it's going to be old shekels, because if you start consecrating now, who knows when the temple is going to be rebuilt? It's not necessarily going to be money that was collected in that present time period. So when it comes to this case, here, when it comes to a convert setting aside money, so this is again a reference to the machloket earlier, when someone converts to Judaism, there's a temple ritual and they have to buy certain things for the temple. So can they set aside that money? If someone converts nowadays, should they set aside money for this? So this money is not old, because doesn't matter, right? It's not a communal offering, so it's really fine. That doesn't have to come from the new money, so that's fine. So Rabbi Yossi is saying that basically explains the discrepancy. In one case, you can't consecrate nowadays, in the other case, you can. But if you do consecrate it, like you shouldn't, but if you do, it's consecrated. And you should just leave that money aside until the temple is built. So you could imagine someone pulling out that half shekel every year and just leaving it in a big heap until the temple is built. And then the Gemara says, Shema yibneh habayit k'varishana. Maybe when the temple is built, it'll be like a whole fresh start. It's not like one day the temple is going to suddenly appear without any warning. I love that this takes us back to the very beginning of the tractate, where we said at the beginning of Nisan, there's an announcement. Everybody, time to get your shekels ready. So maybe that's how the temple will come back. We'll kick it off with an announcement. Listen, like there might be some other logistics you have to get in order, but heads up, it's time to start collecting your shekalim. Maybe that's the way it will happen. So where does this actually take us? Right? What do we actually say about this? So why do we distinguish between the convert's offering, where again it seems like it works to consecrate it, and the shekels where it's not effective, right? Why distinguish if you could just say, well, it'll all be from the Chadash? The Gemara doesn't offer an answer. I loved seeing that in the English here because I think that was the theme of the Yerushalmi for me, was unresolved complications, unresolved questions, unresolved contradictions. The Yerushalmi is not so careful about answering those always. And so Rav Hamnun and Rav Ada bar Abba say in the name of Rav, the halacha is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon that they're not consecrated. So rest assured, if you set aside your shkalim today, we are not even in Nisan anymore. But if you were to do it today, it would not take on that sanctified status. But again, I do think it's really nice, that we have this harking back to the beginning of the tractate, and also I guess it either is or isn't nice depending on whether you accept the darker or the lighter read of Abigail's conundrum, but kind of looking ahead to a new temple system. So Mazal Tov again to everyone who finished, and Abigail will wrap things up with the Hadran.
All right. Okay. Hadran alach mesachet shkalim v'hadrach alan, da'atan alach mesachet shkalim v'atach alan, lo nid'ashem minach mesachet shkalim v'lo tid'ashem minan, lo ba'alma hadin v'lo ba'alma da'ate. Yehir atom l'fnecha Adonai Eloheinu v'Elohei Avotenu, shetehei taratcha u'menantenu ba'olam hazeh, v'tehei iman u'le'olam haba. Chanina bar Papa, Rami bar Papa, Nachman bar Papa, Achai bar Papa, Abba Mari bar Papa, Rafram bar Papa, Rachish bar Papa, Sorchav bar Papa, Ada bar Papa, Daru bar Papa. Ha'arev na Adonai Eloheinu et divrei taratcha b'finu u'v'fi amcha beit Yisrael, v'niheh anachnu v'tzeta'enu v'tzeta'ei amcha beit Yisrael, kulanu yodei shemecha v'lomdei taratecha lishma. Me'evai techakmeni mitzvotecha ki li'olam hili. Yihili bi tamim b'chukecha leman lo evosh, li'olam lo ashkach pikudecha kivam chiyitani. Baruch atah Adonai lamdeni chukecha, amen, 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 sala va'ed.
Beautiful, amen. So that's the beginning of the Hadran. Those of you who are making a Siyum elsewhere might read more of it. It's all findable on Sefaria, but we just affirm, this should say Tractate Shekalim, but we just affirm that we're going to return to the tractate that we have begun learning, because we only learned it once this time. And we'll return to it. It should stay with us in some way. The knowledge that we've gained, the learning that we've done, whatever time you've put in, whether it's 5 minutes a day or a few hours a week, or maybe you're just jumping on the Daf Yomi train, all that learning should please stay with us and inform our lives in important ways. And we are on to the next tractate. So Mazal Tov again. Lizzie, are there any questions before we wrap up?
There are not any questions, but I wanted to thank everybody again for coming and for the comments that you offered in the chat. I also wanted to welcome everybody to sign up for event details and reminders for a wonderful book talk that we have coming up with Dr. Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg. In conversation with Dr. Ilana Stein-Hain, Dr. Zornberg is going to be talking about her book, Moses, A Human Life, which is found on Sefaria. And so I am going to post the link to sign up for details in the chat, and we hope to see you there.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.